there is the emotional toll that it takes because you take in these animals and they aren't pieces of furniture. They are your friends, and they rely on you for their emotional needs and for their physical needs, and we fall in love with them. We love them. We love them with our whole hearts, and they don't live as long as we do. So you fall in love and then you say goodbye, and then you fall in love and then you say goodbye. And when you do that dozens and then scores and then hundreds of times, it's heavy on your heart. And then you have to pull yourself back and keep going because you've got to be there open-hearted for the next one.
Hello and welcome to the Plant Paradigm Podcast, where we have inspiring conversations with amazing individuals from all around the world and look for ways to create a clean, green, and sustainable future for us, the planet, and all beings. I'm your host, Tom Simak, a fellow plant eater and athlete who's here to help facilitate those impactful conversations. Who you heard at the beginning was Cathy Stevens. But just before we get into the episode, I've had my morning coffee and it had some mushrooms in it because I had my Four Sigmatic brew today. It is really exciting. It feels good. It tastes great. And for anyone looking to increase their mushroom intake, head over to foursigmatic.com and or follow the link in my show notes below and enter code PLANT10, PLANT number 10 at checkout for 10% off your purchase. And I just want to mention, for those visually inclined, all these interviews and conversations do go up on YouTube. So if you want to watch that, I've also leave all the links to do so in the show notes below. And for those on YouTube at the moment watching this, hi, how you going? I'll give you a little bit of a wave to acknowledge your presence there. I appreciate you taking the time to choose this podcast as the one you're going to listen to today. I really, really am appreciative and grateful of that fact. Now, on to the episode. Today we're speaking to author, activist, and founder of Catskill Animal Sanctuary, Cathy Stevens. Catskill, impressively, has saved more than 5,000 non-human individuals through direct rescue. This will be an episode about kindness, compassion, and definitely want to tune in to for the animal lovers out there. We're going to be talking a lot about how to converse with people and the hard things about running and directing a sanctuary. This is a very wholesome conversation, and I appreciated having Cathy on the show quite a bit, and I think you'll definitely get something out of this episode. And I think that would be, if I were to infer, the way that we communicate with other people. So, with all that being said, I hope you do enjoy the episode, and I'll see you on the other side.
It's always a good day when I go kiss Tucker.
You kissed your cow?
Oh my goodness, I kiss him. Every day I'm here, I kiss him.
Really? So is that like a way that you share compassion with that animal? With Tucker?
It's one of many ways, yeah.
And that's willingly received, or are you like grabbing his face, come here and give Cathy?
Oh no, I've known him since he was a baby. He came here from a petting zoo, and we have an extraordinary bond.
Beautiful. Well, that's so funny about petting zoos, because a lot of people, would you say petting zoos are ethical on that note?
I wouldn't, no, because at least in this country, what petting zoos do, in our environment where you have 4 distinct seasons and winter is cold and really the only outdoor activities are limited to skiing or snowboarding or snowshoeing, petting zoos are seasonal. So they're open for warm weather, and then they shut down for the winter. Well, it doesn't pay for them to feed and house animals through the winter. So they auction them off at the end of the winter. So first of all, in petting zoos, they're for the people. These are animals being used as entertainment. They're in very small, unnatural environments. They're often fed a really unhealthy diet because one little way for the petting zoo to to bring in more money is to provide pellets that you pay a quarter for or what have you, some modest amount of money. And so, it's problematic from the get-go, but then the even worse situation is that at the end of the season, the animals are auctioned off. And auction, of course, is a euphemism for slaughter because there's no demand for pet sheep or companion cows or what have you. So, no, not a fan of petting zoos. And, we live in this world where humanity isn't encouraged to ask those big questions, and we are now paying the price in every way imaginable for acting throughout time as if we're the only ones who matter. So petting zoos are one tiny example of a symptom of that huge problem.
That's really funny. I actually didn't know. Like, I've been vegan for 7 years, and I had never ever thought about petting zoos. I always knew, okay, that's a no-go. You don't touch petting zoos, and I knew that that wasn't ethical, much like a lot of other systems that just use animals like that. But I never actually thought the end life of petting zoos. But I would also question: are they living a good life while in the process, or I guess in the industry? Because I would imagine if I was a horse or a pig in a petting zoo, I'd be quite stressed at the amount of people around. Do you think they're living a good life?
No, I don't. I think they are bored out of their minds. They're confined. There's no petting zoo that's comprised of acres and acres of pasture where you walk out to meet the animal in this setting that's much akin to where they would live normally. They're often on the road. They're often roadside for the convenience of the public. And so everyone I've ever seen has an animal confined in a tiny space, a space the size of a stall, 10 feet by 12 feet or something like that. So I wouldn't say they're stressed because all they do all day long, stressed in the sense that you're talking about, Tom, stressed as in fearful or uncertain, stressed as in like enough already with humanity, like get out of my face, that kind of stress.
Mm.
I've had, 210 people fawning all over me all day. I really don't want 211. So it's that I am sure what I would call like the psychic exhaustion of not being able to have their privacy, their quiet time, their friendships with other animals, their space to graze or to do whatever an animal would do naturally.
For sure. It definitely doesn't give them space to foster their own individuality and their personality. And I think to set the preface for that, we hop, skip, jumped a little bit at the beginning, but you run this incredible 150-acre sanctuary for animals in the Hudson Valley, where, from my memory, you have more than 300 rescued animals. Can you kind of give us a rundown on what it is Catskill does?
Yes. So everything you just said is accurate, although the number of the animals, as with any sanctuary, varies wildly because sometimes you're rescuing one pig or one old blind horse, but oftentimes you're rescuing 50 or 60 birds, for example. So that number always fluctuates, but we have historically somewhere between 250 and 400 animals on our on our land. And we take in 10 species of farmed animals who are used for food. So all the birds, geese, chickens, turkeys, ducks, horses, cows, pigs, goats, sheep. And we also take in horses, and horses aren't consumed in our country, but horses are used for human entertainment and then shipped when they're when they are no longer winning races or no longer capable of running around barrels at a rodeo or what have you, then so many of them are shipped to Canada and Mexico where slaughter is legal, and then the meat is shipped to countries where horses are consumed, like France, for example, France and Japan, for example.
Right. Yeah, that's
So
pretty.
the
I was just going to say
sorry.
with horses, it's so interesting that you don't consume. Like in Australia, it actually gets turned into dog food. I'm surprised that that kind of system isn't really prevalent over there.
Well, um, lots of their parts. This gets pretty grim right away, Tom. But lots
Yeah.
of their parts, their extremities, the parts that aren't consumed by humans are turned into food for other animals for sure. But their flesh is consumed in different parts of the world.
Right.
So that's who we take in, these 10 species of animals who come here generally broken, like broken physically and or broken psychologically, because again, generally, they haven't known a moment's kindness. They've only known humans who are there to turn them into something. So they're going through this system that's pushing them, getting them to grow as quickly as possible in as confined a space as possible. Or in the case of horses, the vast majority of who we've taken in have been from animal hoarders. So they've lived wretched lives. So they come here in that physical state and in that psychological state. And then our extraordinary responsibility, but mostly privilege, is to use all that we have, all of our tools, to say you're safe, you're loved, you matter. And then the gift is that we get to watch who these beings turn into. We get to nurture that and watch them. And some of them, I was a teacher for years, and it's no different than watching students become over the course of a year potentially somebody very different than who they were in September. And so similarly with these animals, some of them don't want to be the center of attention. Some of them never particularly warm up to human beings, and that's fine. They get to have that choice. But so many become breathtakingly, like disarmingly, deeply affectionate, no matter their species, like chickens who fall asleep in our laps and turkeys who give us hugs and put their necks over our shoulders, literally to hug us and run to us when we call their names, and cows who lick our faces until you have to pull away because you'll bleed because their tongue is like a cat's tongue on steroids. So this is who some of them become. And then we are there with our educational programs to connect people who consider themselves animal lovers and who aren't consciously trying to harm, just like you weren't trying to harm. I wasn't trying to harm. I was trying to feed myself. Right? Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I can't wait to torture animals 3 times today. No, nobody's doing that. We're just feeding ourselves. So the animals become such an important part of helping people understand what they're participating in. And so the other half of our operation, we do this emergency rescue and sanctuary. The other half is the educational program, which is tours and a cooking program and the podcast, all these things that help people connect the dots and then begin or accelerate the journey.
Wow, there's so much to dissect there, and it is such a cool thing. Like just the concept. I'm sure a lot of people maybe even had a warm sensation when you think of like a turkey or a geese or something, just putting their neck around your shoulder and having that really intimate, special moment with a non-human animal. That would be. Oh, that makes me kind of jealous of you, Kathy, if I were to be completely honest. But
there are sanctuaries in your country, Tom, and you could go and experience that.
100%. Definitely.
Mm.
Before we move on, I just have a question out of my own curiosity. Where did the name Catskill come from if you're not really focusing on rescuing cats?
Cats. We're in the Catskill Mountains.
Right. Okay.
It's a mountain range. It's a small, kind of a minor mountain range, but it's a whole region. And so we just, to sort of identify ourselves, did that.
Perfect.
I kind of wish we hadn't.
Oh, really?
And, one of these days it may be time to rethink that, but
What would you
that's
name
who
it?
we are right now. Something that didn't regionalize us. We actually had that conversation 5 or 6 years ago, but didn't come up with anything that particularly worked. So I don't know. We came up with things we came up with blind horse sanctuary and something with goats, things that were all way too specific. So I don't know. And that will be for the next generation who succeed me to take that on if they want to.
Beautiful. Look, well, you said a lot of people don't make that conscious decision, like I'm going to contribute pain and suffering 3 times a day to feed myself. And it's true, there is that cognitive dissonance for like a majority of our population, sadly. And on your website, you actually say that 94% of the visitors are non-vegan. And so I'm curious as to the communication side of things, how you've taken your educational background, taken the lessons you've learned in the preceding years, and how you communicate. Because I don't know, we have a sanctuary, like you mentioned, around where I am called Edgar's Mission, and it's quite well known around the
Yes.
area. And I haven't been yet, but I plan on going this year. But apparently, they don't actually mention the word vegan, and I'm not sure how true that is. But how are you communicating this with people in a way that makes them more receptive to maybe understanding that they are partly the reason, I guess, in a cynical way, that this animal is here?
So, first of all, when you visit Edgar's Mission, Pam Ahern and Kyle have visited here. So please give them my best.
Will do.
All right. So I was a high school English teacher for 12 years. I also in graduate school studied social change movements and how they come about, and learned the most important thing I learned, which really is kind of an obvious thing, but it was brought to my conscious attention when we studied all the ways a civil rights movement happened and is still happening, from the protests to the churches to from the more militant approach to the more conservative, much more conservative approach, from leafleting to demonstrations to provocation to policy, lobbying for policy changes. And so if you start from this base assumption that, and this is a choice because there's lots of evidence to the contrary, but if you start from this base level assumption that people are good and that for the most part we want to live moral lives rooted in kindness, lives rooted in compassion, and that is our starting point. Even though we are also selfish, that is our starting point. Then, and I personally believe that, I don't believe, I know that we aren't intending to harm. And I know, as do you, as do your listeners, that these industries have been so extraordinarily effective over the years at hiding the truth from what we do. We don't see slaughter the way you do in other countries. We don't see how they're, I don't even use the word raised. I use the word grown because raise implies care. And there's no care. They're just grown as quickly as possible in the smallest amount of space possible because that's the cheapest way possible. So if you start with those foundational things, people are good, nobody's intending to harm, and people don't know the truth, then those things taken together compel us. And look, I am 60. How old am I? 63 years old. I have still spent the vast majority of my life eating animals. And good God, Tom, God, I've loved animals since I came out of the womb. And so if you ruminate on all of these things, then you very quickly get to the point where you've got to do this with love. You've got to do it with non-judgment. You've got to do it with the it, meaning it referring to one's approach to encouraging veganism. One has to do it with a teaching component, because I can share story after story but I'll just share one of somebody for whom the light bulb went off. A man ran up to me in our parking lot. He locked eyes with me. He had just finished a tour, and he ran up, young man, grabbed my forearms, burst into tears, and said, "I get it now. Please tell me what to do." So if you put all these truths together, they necessitate patience, leading with love, teaching. And the vegan is still a word that generates, it's still a charged word. It's still a word that if you use it, people for whom you're using it feel judged, with whom you're using it sometimes feel judged. We don't not use it. We don't not use it, but we are having conversations about whether we want to substitute plant-based, because honestly, who cares? It's as long as what you are doing is creating the greatest possible number of vegans. Right? So you look at 15 sanctuaries, and everybody has a different approach. And there are plenty who are more strident than we are, and plenty who are softer and actively choose never to use that word. So we're constantly in conversation about that very question. So it's interesting that you bring it up. But I hope in this very long-winded way I answered it.
Yeah, oh, definitely. That story of the young fella gave me a bit of goosebumps, because that's what, at the end of the day, if you're passionate about animal rights, animal justice, and the ethics around all this, that is like the most ideal result. And you'd wish in a lot of ways that every single conversation you had with people ended up like that. People just saw it like you do, but it's not always the case, unfortunately. And I'm not, my head's not under the sand about that. I'm curious to know, based on that, you've been running Catskill for quite a while. Have you noticed the conversations change, the perspectives change of the people visiting?
Hugely. In the early 2000s, we routinely would hear comments, that's a nice slab of bacon. Routinely hear comments like that. Or people would joke about how that chicken wasn't as cute as the chicken they were going to have when they went to McDonald's right after the tour. That was constant. And now, not only do we almost never, ever hear that kind of comment, what we hear is people really wanting to engage with us because they know they should, and they know they want to begin that journey or accelerate that journey, and they just need a little hand holding or some cheering on. So it's profoundly different than it was 2 decades ago.
Yeah, I'm so glad to hear that. I'm assuming, like, even not being on the ground where you are, that it would be quite quite a big difference. I think we're just becoming more receptive as a society, especially with the proliferation of certain documentaries that we all know, like Game Changers and Cowspiracy and etc., that wasn't available, 15 odd years ago. At least the easy to access this kind of information wasn't as viable. But I wanted
No.
to know, what is something that's really hard to run. Well, why I guess where I want to go to this question, I've met some sanctuary owners before and only heard how difficult it is to run a sanctuary. I want to know if you have the same experience.
It's not for the faint of heart.
Why is
It is
that?
not. Oh, emergencies happen any time of the day or night. There is no, oh, good Lord. You just asked a big question. There's everything from, on the most basic level of survival, an increasingly uncertain funding climate. You know, far more. There used to be a handful of sanctuaries. Now there are hundreds. So more, and the donor base has not grown at the rate of the growth of sanctuaries, but not even close. So there might be a little bit more money to go around, but it hasn't kept pace with the growth rate of sanctuaries. So there is this constant pressure to become more creative, more resourceful, to expand either your number of donors or the ways in which you bring in money. So that's sort of always under the surface. There is the increasing threat of zoonotic diseases. So you're constantly having to develop more and more protocols to prevent the spread of disease among your animals, to prevent even the possibility of, in the event that a disease were to become zoonotic and transfer to humans, that you have absolutely gotten rid of that risk. So there's huge work around protocols and safety measures and quarantine suits and all of that. There is the emotional toll that it takes, because you take in these animals and they aren't pieces of furniture. They are your friends, and they rely on you for their emotional needs and for their physical needs, and we fall in love with them. We love them. We love them with our whole hearts, and they don't live as long as we do. So you fall in love and then you say goodbye, and then you fall in love and then you say goodbye. And when you do that dozens and then scores and then hundreds of times, it's heavy on your heart. And then you have to pull yourself back and keep going, because you've got to be there open-hearted for the next one. And so those are, and then honestly, Tom, sanctuary directors, you said owner, but there is no owner, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's a nonprofit. Sanctuary directors, sanctuary staff, whether they're here doing communications or here doing our finances or doing direct animal care or something else, we are all here because we want to change the world for animals. And many of us are here because we want the world to be a kind and loving place for every single being that breathes. And so you look at what's happening in the world and the contrast between where the world needs to be, which is vegan, And where it is, with meat consumption increasing around the world, is a tough thing to face. And particularly with climate change escalating, in part because of our diet, that's also a heavy weight, because that brings this crazy impatience. What do we need to do differently? What do we need to do better? How can we say it differently in a way that will help people not say, I should eat a little less meat, but say instead, I am going to stop eating animals. So that's why it's hard. That's some of it.
That's super heavy. I mean, from the perspective of someone who is at a sanctuary day in, day out and creating these beautiful relationships, much like a mother does with their child, and then having someone depend on you and then losing that somebody would be, I mean, anyone who has had a common pet or companion animal, should I say, a dog or a cat, hamster, rabbit, these people can definitely relate. You know, people keep pictures of their companion animals long after they've passed, so they understand that. And having dozens and hundreds of those experiences, I truthfully don't envy that, but the work is still abundantly important. So I guess I understand like that internal drive of this next individual that's coming through our sanctuary. They shouldn't have to have a lesser experience because of my reserves, because I've just lost someone I care about. So I understand. I'm guessing that's where you're coming from on a deep psychological level.
It absolutely is. You just have to have the same amount of stuff to offer the next one.
Mm-hmm.
And luckily, love is infinite. Luckily, it's infinite. And you know, the animals teach us that over and over. These animals who've known horror but come here willing to forgive and to start new, and to say, you know, I've had this wretched experience, but tell me who you are. Let me see who you are. So they make that part easier.
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell you one story, because we started the conversation with a conversation about Tucker the cow, who came from a petting zoo. Tucker is now 13 and a half years old. He's a massive, massive steer, came from a dairy breed. He's 6'4" at the shoulder.
Oh my
And
God.
about that big, and probably around 2,500 pounds. And he and I have an extraordinary bond, because he's been here since he was a baby. He lived right outside my house and would call to me at night, and I would go and we would hang out. And lots of stories about why we're connected, but we are deeply connected. And the other day, the cow farrier was here. The cow farrier trims their hooves. And Tucker, they put them in this big device that lifts them off the ground, that keeps them safe and keeps the humans and the animals safe. It's not painful. Tucker's used to it. He's gone through it a million times. But apparently, I wasn't there. This time, he sort of stumbled out of this device,
Mm-hmm.
and he fell. He had a couple little scrapes, and he was upset. Well, I heard about it after the fact. And Tucker is a cow who doesn't moo. He only moos when he's not very verbal. He only moos when he is extremely, extremely upset. Well, I was doing something else, and this was maybe an hour after he had fallen, and I went past his field. I can't remember what I was doing, but I could not stop. I went past his field, and he mooed, moo, moo, moo. And I said, Tucker, I am so sorry. I know you're upset. I'll come see you tonight. I'm so sorry. Whatever I said. I went to see him that night, and for the first time in 13 and a half years, he walked away from me. He was furious. He was furious with me. And for a few days, he wouldn't come to me. He usually comes to me. He usually buries his head in my chest. He licks and scratches and walked away. Now, people don't understand. I tell this long story because it's one of thousands I could tell about how animals have every single emotion we do. We know that about our dogs and cats, right? But we live in a culture that doesn't encourage us to see that about the animals who wind up on our plates.
Yeah, we need to make a cartoon about Tucker the cow. Um, that's really, really a beautiful story about how, they're not. I mean, I think humans have this weird superiority complex where we just put ourselves above these other beings, even though, it's like that whole story of if you judge a fish by how it can climb a tree, it's going to live its whole life thinking it's dumb. And because we think, okay, cows can't do calculus, therefore they're dumb, we put them in this box, which is really not the right way to go about it. But I want to hear your perspective on, like, people listening to this can obviously see that you have an immense level of compassion for these animals at a very deep level. Something I heard quite a bit back on my days when I was doing street activism is that these farmers care about their animals and they have a level of compassion, and that some of them would even go so far as sending the animals to slaughter. That's what we would usually go to in conversation. That's the hardest thing they have to do. Where would you say that would you say that is even a level of compassion? Where are they going wrong? Or would you say that their work based on their needs, because they are most likely born into this generational farming that they maybe don't even want to do, like, is that how you link that compassion to the farmer? Or how do you have, because they're doing this act that we don't support, but through my age I'm starting to understand, and then that's conflicting with my other beliefs. But where do you sit on that field?
Well, thank you for that question. I love that question, Tom. I would just say, in the same way that one can't generalize about animals, 10 chickens have 10 personalities. 10 dogs have 10 personalities. We all know that. Well, 10 chickens had 10 anythings. 10 farmers are all going to be different. Yes, in part, a lot of them have done this generationally, for, from great grandfather to grandfather to father to son. Yes, many absolutely love their animals. And yes, many of them are torn to shreds when they have to send their animals off to slaughter. But I think it's important to distinguish between the big corporate model, that faceless corporate model that grows 99% of our food, right? Where farmers, most of whom, by the way, still hold the belief that we need animal protein in order to be healthy. Most farmers don't believe. Farmers, for the most part, raised in a pretty mainstream way. For the most part, they're going to be pretty conventional people. And so, like the majority of us still, despite all the evidence to the contrary, farmers believe that we have to eat animals to be healthy. So farmers believe deeply, deeply that they are feeding the world. And I know from knowing farmers that the small farmers are often find that piece of it difficult. And in fact, you might, and I could put you in touch with him if he's willing to come on. That would be tough. But I could certainly put you in touch with a guy named Bob Comus. Do you know that name?
No, I don't.
Okay. Bob Comus was a farmer of pigs who finally, small farmer, finally faced what he was doing. He kept comparing his dog to these pigs and realized how smart, how individual, how sensitive they were, and in the end was haunted and gave it up. Well, there is a very gently powerful documentary about his life and his choice to give up farming, that's called The Last Pig. In the end, he had to choose. He could only find sanctuary for 8 of his, I believe it was 200 pigs. And so he had to find a reason to save these 8 and send the rest to slaughter. 2 of them wound up coming to us. One was his smartest pig, and one was his kindest pig. And they're still with us today. But Bob was tormented every time, and he talks about this in the film, every time he had to load up those animals. So I think he thought he was feeding the world. He accepted the reality that slaughter was the end result. So I think there are a lot of farmers who fall into that category. I think on the corporate level, farmers give up every decision: what to feed, when to feed, how to house, when to send them to slaughter. And then they get caught up in this wretched system. And I can give you another name of a person to chat with about this, the evils of the system and how bad it is for the farmers as well. So a lot of them feel trapped. And yet, despite all those challenges, you see them now. They're leaving and they're looking for alternatives. And there's one large organization in this country, Mercy for Animals, and then there's actually a sanctuary in Texas who have programs that are designed to help the farmer who wants to leave the system grow something else, grow mushrooms or grow. And so let's not demonize the people who believe they're doing good, I would say. And let's not oversimplify and put them all in one bucket or paint them with a broad brush.
I'm really stoked that you answered that question in your Kathy compassionate way. I couldn't agree more. It's so fitting to what I'm kind of understanding as a perspective. I watched this little documentary yesterday called, it was just by ABC, and it was about JBS, and they've taken over like one of Tasmania's largest salmon aquaculture farms called Huon, and everyone, it's a great documentary. I'll leave it linked up in the show notes for those who haven't watched it, but they have a very long, very corrupt history with how they've kind of taking over lots of countries in the US. Swift Foods are a big example. And it was actually really fascinating. Part of the documentary, which I never thought about, and it's exactly to your point, there was this farming family near, kind of close to where I live in country Victoria, and they're saying, we were petrified that JBS was taking over, and they were a pig farm, and they said, these people are now going to dictate what we feed our pigs. They're going to dictate the price they will purchase them for, and they'll dictate at what age we send them to the slaughter. And I thought, that's insane that and they said a small portion of farmers are, they're happy about it because they have, JBS are the experts. And from what I understood, these a lot of the local farmers were just horrified at this, and they were not happy about going into this system. Like, farmers know that the industrialized part of this industry is toxic for everyone involved, especially and they touched on like human rights and things like that within the industry, and injuries and all that kind of stuff. And I think, to the wider point, something that I think is incredibly important to understand, and you touched on it so eloquently, is that, we have to stop thinking about the animals that are in our supermarkets as coming from these small family farms. Like, they are faceless, blank corporations 99% of the time. And it's, I guess, hard to have compassion in that sense. So when we're thinking about farmers, I understand the point of having compassion for these farmers, but for the corporation, that's the one, I guess, for lack of a better term, we have to be fighting here, fighting for the rights of not only the animals, but for the farmers that are losing their livelihoods, not having, or being their hand forced to either go bankrupt because they have these insane debts that they can't pay without.
Oh, wretched, horrid. Yeah.
And, to your point, I'm really happy that there are alternative agricultural modalities that they can follow through, such as hemp, such as almonds, such as mushrooms that you mentioned. So I think that is really important, and a great exercise on perspective on how we can have more compassion for the farmers, because I think that is something that maybe vegans can do a little bit better on, if I were to be completely honest, is shifting that perspective and then having a sense of compassion and understanding.
Tom, you know who I get the most impatient with in 22 years of doing this work?
Internet trolls.
I who?
Internet trolls?
Internet trolls. Yeah, internet trolls. Impatient vegans. Like, this is what I've seen hundreds of times. People who, I'm going to just pick a random number. 34 years of life, you eat animals. And then you wake up on Tuesday, March 18th as vegan. For whatever reason, you decide to be vegan. And then on Wednesday, March 19th, you're going to be intolerant of anybody who's not vegan? Like, really? Come on! Like, come on! Like, unless you have never put an animal product in your mouth, please have compassion and get off that stance of judgment and intolerance. I understand because the need is so dire and the urgency is so great, and because we're running out of time, because of climate change, and because the suffering is so vast and barbaric. I get it. But if it took you 34 years, then mightn't it take somebody else the same amount of time? And so that's what with your audience that is listening who are vegan, like, I would encourage you to check that impulse, because it is not going to further that which you seek.
Yeah, 100%. And I think a really good way to summarize that, I'm currently reading How to Win Friends and Influence People, and
Influence people. I have it on my bookshelf.
100%. It's a great book, I would say, for activism, especially, and coming from it in, like, what would you say that you've learnt lessons in that book that you've applied to the way you communicate with people?
Oh, I haven't read it since I haven't read it in forever. There's another one that's you might check out that's in that vein, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Read
that one. It's a good one. It's just about understanding and coming from a place of compassion. Definitely. Like, I've tried militancy, but I guess why I brought the book up is, if you're going about it in an aggressive way, who is that conversation for? Is it for the animals, or is it for you? Are you? It is for you, and again, I get it. I do. I've been there, and it felt good, but there was no animal saved in the process. And I think as you got, maybe everyone needs that. Maybe every vegan that decides I need to try out my militancy, bugger, but you have to go through that and figure out, okay, I don't think I saved a chicken or a horse or a cow, whatever it may be. And so I think it's just about being consciously aware of how you are communicating, why you're communicating, and is that communication being effective to the purpose you want to bring it to. Like if someone, the only way you can change people is making them want to change, not by drilling things down their point, unless you have a gun and you're just like, don't eat meat. You can't do it any other way.
Well, there's a broadcaster over here called Jane Velez Mitchell, who's very well known in vegan circles. She's a great lady. She's a firecracker. She lives in LA. She would disagree with both of us because she
Really?
tells a very powerful story of how she went vegan because somebody pointed in her face and yelled to her that meat was liquid meat, that dairy was liquid meat. And she said she went vegan on the spot. And she's very combative. But look, this is the largest and the most urgent social change movement in history. And different as social change history tells us, different approaches work for different people. And
Mhm.
maybe the screaming and the rage work for a handful of people because maybe that tiny handful need to be shocked into reality.
Mhm.
But for the most part, what do when somebody's screaming at us? Our guard goes up
Mhm.
and we shut down. We don't. And so I personally am not a fan and always advocate for that other approach that keeps people open and receptive and wanting to hear more and open, most importantly, to feeling more because the power of sanctuaries is not what we humans are saying
Mhm.
for the most part with our words, but more than that, what the animals are saying with their actions.
That's really powerful. It's like the animals don't need to be yelling at you. I'm sure they'd love to, but yeah, that's a really, really good point. Look, I would agree that militancy has its place. And I think like sharing slaughter videos on like YouTube or wherever it is, I think that is part passive activism, but also part militant activism as well. So there is certain
I
percentages that you can
agree.
do.
Yes, yes.
But coming towards the end, I just have a few more questions about the sanctuary that have come up in my brain that I'd love to know. So there is like this wide standing, I guess, notion that, oh, vegans aren't perfect because vegetables and grains and these kind of things still kill animals such as pests, insects, maybe possums sometimes, and these kind of creatures. So I don't want to go into that part of things, but we can't not kind of recognize that there are predators out there. Does your sanctuary, the animals that fall within that, have a risk to these predators? And if so, how do you manage that?
Uh, okay, so we have two kinds of animals, sort of undesirable animals.
Mhm.
We have rats and pigeons who carry disease, and we use birth control for them. Edible birth control that we understand is like chocolate cake for them, and they consume it, and it sterilizes the males and the females. Um,
Wow.
it's the downside is that it's very expensive, and then we do have coyotes
Hmm.
and other predators. So we for the animals who are vulnerable to predators, fox and coyotes aren't going to take down a cow or a horse. But for the animals who are vulnerable to predators, we lock them into secure barns at night, whereas the bigger animals are don't get that. The only time bigger animals are closed in at night is if the wind, if they're really, really, really compromised, like our 35-year-old blind horses, for
Mhm.
example, go into the barn at night, or the weather is ridiculous and they would suffer. But the others get locked into secure shelters. And then we have uh, lots of things that keep the coyotes, hopefully keep the coyotes in the woods that we have, so such as flags and sounds to scare them off and wolf urine and those kinds of things. So if what you're really asking is if there were ever a circumstance in which we would kill another animal who was a threat to our animals, uh the answer is no. We would try. We would try to find a workaround. Now, that doesn't mean we have never lost animals to predators, because we have. We've lost animals to eagles. Um, we've lost animals. There have been an occasional break in, and then we've really realized, oh, we need a different kind of building, or we need some, right? So we have occasionally lost animals to predators, but we immediately address, if it's a vulnerability, the vulnerability, and then move on. So we are doing our damnedest. And I would say that the majority of sanctuaries are like this. Not all, some will
Mhm.
kill rats, for example, um, to live in harmony with all beings, even the ones who are at risk to our guys.
Mm. The birth control is incredibly fast. I had no idea that that exists. And what's really fascinating in a way is I really am starting. I don't think I'll ever understand how expensive it is to run a sanctuary. Like that is just. It's like but some people don't have kids, human childs, because they're just so expensive. Studies say it'll cost between 500,000, 800,000 before the kid's even 18 to support them through everything. Now,
Yeah,
imagine having
I believe
300 of
that.
them. So it's, I really understand. I guess what I want to just add in here as my little one on one for people is me and my fiance, we don't give physical gifts unless it's something that person will use for a very long time. And instead, what we do is we go for experiences. So, a
Hmm.
good example for people, and I'm sure you'll agree in many ways, is the reason we're going to Edgar's mission is because it's our nephew's birthday. And so instead of getting him a toy, we're taking him to a sanctuary. And so, one, you're supporting this sanctuary and you're having this beautiful experience with someone else you love and care about. So, I just wanted to take this opportunity while it was kind of on the mark, because we can kind of assume that sanctuaries of all kinds are expensive to run. So, I think it's a great gift idea to take someone with you, have this awesome experience with a sanctuary. And I'm sure you'll agree in many ways.
Oh, it's transformative. It's people leave sanctuaries, the good sanctuaries, and there are lots dotted around the country, uh, transformed.
So good.
We, it's just a fact. And is that 6-year-old, when he turns 16, is probably gonna still have that warm memory of
Mm.
meeting that pig for the first time, whereas that bulldozer you gave him when he was 6 has long long been
It's
put
long
on the
forgotten.
trash heap.
Yeah.
Yeah, long forgotten.
Incredible. So there's so much we touched on today's conversation. I think a huge takeaway is just imploring a bit more compassion into everyone's life. I think it's something much like love is abundant and limitless. So is compassion if you tap into it properly. How I love to finish these conversations is by getting one more nugget from you, Kathy. I want, given everything we've talked about today, or it could be something completely irrelevant from this conversation, somewhere your mind's been these past few, however many days, weeks, months, or years. I want you to leave us all with one little bit of Kathy wisdom that you think will benefit us and our listeners.
Thank you for that opportunity, Tom. what I've begun to say consciously to myself, particularly since COVID, is that I have the most extraordinary of gifts. I have a human body. I have a white human body. I was born to parents who loved me. And I bet those three extraordinary gifts apply to most of your listeners. If we have these things, a human body with all its privileges and all its capacities, and we have the further extraordinary gift of being white in this world and not having a level of concern, worry, challenge that people of color do, and we further have been loved by our parents and have good friends, we have won the lottery. And it becomes our ethical obligation to do everything that we can to identify our greatest strengths. What do I do really well? It's not very many things. I do a lot of things okay. I stink at a lot of things. I do a few things really well. For us to identify those and to use those for the greater good. That is what has been on my mind lately.
You're right. We have a moral imperative to live the most ethical lifestyle for us and also to imbue that onto other people. What a beautiful way to finish this conversation. And I do want to end with a bit of thank you, not just for yourself, Kathy, for jumping on and having this conversation with us and leaving us with a lot of different wisdom nuggets and something to think about as we're driving or walking or whatever you're doing, listening to this conversation. But thank you for the incredible work that you and your team at Catskill do. Obviously, it's something not a lot of people have the resources to do. Globally, if you're not around, you can't visit Catskill and understand the level of love and compassion that you put into it. But I'm sure from this conversation, we can understand that these animals are in good hands. So I'm really grateful that these animals, obviously, they can speak in their own way, much like Tucker, but they can't speak English. So I'm going to thank you on their behalf for taking care of them when it is much needed within the current, I guess, build of society that we have. So thank you so much for running Catskill and the incredible work you guys do there. And thank you again for the time you've spent with us today, sharing your wisdom.
Thank you, Tom. It's an extraordinary privilege, and I work with a team of beautiful people. So I am going to convey your thanks as soon as we're done. Thank you very much. It's been a joy.
Hi there. Welcome to the end of the episode. Thank you for watching and or listening the whole way through. I really appreciate that. That takes a lot of effort to sit here for an hour and choose a podcast and then listen to it and or watch it. So thank you so much. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a 5-star review on any app that you listen to this show on. If you're on YouTube, like, comment, subscribe. That's all the good stuff you can do there. Head over to social media and click that follow button there. And thank you to Kathy for coming on and sharing this really wholesome and impactful conversation. I'll leave all the links to Catskill and herself in the show notes below. So for anyone wanting to check out her podcast or any of the things they do, please feel free to do so. If you have some money to donate to the work they do, if you want to drop in $1, $2, $10, $100, I don't know how much you have, that is also, I'm sure, very, very welcome. But with all that being said, I will see you on next week's episode. Stay happy, eat plants, peace.